Hello, I'm Michael Brendan Dougherty, and I'm here with Adam Serwer. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Adam Serwer with Mother Jones.
And I'm the politics editor at Business Insider and contributor at the American Conservative. And this is, I believe, the premiere episode of Washington Squares, one of these newer branded blogging head shows, and I'm really delighted to have Adam on.
Congratulations.
Thank you. It should be fun. And so I thought we'd start with just sort of the story that seems to suck up all oxygen, which is the election.
Mm-hmm.
And you and I have different opinions about where it's headed. I'm of the opinion that I share George Will's opinion, essentially, that Barack Obama's basically got this, and Republicans can worry about other things, like maybe trying to win Congress, but that, vote for a Republican if you like to, but there's probably no use in it. And I think that because the economy is very good, and I think the candidates on the Republican side don't fit the time.
Mm-hmm.
I don't feel like Romney's turnaround artist selling point fits a time when the economy seems to be turning around already.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'm somewhat indifferent to who's president. I usually think I haven't liked the presidents in my lifetime yet. But I do think Republicans who do care should despair.
Well, so I think Republicans are despairing entirely too early, and Democrats are dancing in the end zone before we even pass the 50-yard line. Like I think what's happened. I mean, certainly the discourse right now, which is fraught with sort of what people refer to as culture war issues, but what I think are actually like substantive public policy issues talked about in very silly ways. That sort of reflects the fact that the economy is becoming less of an issue in the election itself. I mean, I remember you can sort of like see the sort of journey of the economy in the sort of case, the sort of symbolic things that Republicans focused on in order to show that Obama was a terrible president on the economy. In 2009, it was the Dow, and then when the Dow recovered, everybody started talking about unemployment, and now that unemployment seems to be going down for real, we're talking about gas prices.
Right.
But I think that it's we're months away from the election, and I think that there's any number of things that could happen. We could get into a war with Iran, and then gas prices would go up to $10 gajillion a barrel. We could, something could happen in the Eurozone. And I just think that, in some ways, we don't really know what the economy is going to look like on November 2nd. I mean, certainly if things go the way they're going, I think Obama has a better than even chance at winning, but I don't know that it's time for Republicans to despair yet, or for Democrats to feel particularly celebratory.
Yeah, I mean, of course, in 2008, we didn't know that the financial collapse would become the big issue. I mean, a lot of the debate time was spent relitigating the Iraq War on the Democratic side. A lot of, the debate on the Republican side seemed to be about other foreign policy issues. And then all of a sudden, you had John McCain quitting his campaign to come and save the economy somehow. And so, no, I guess we can't predict. But I do think it reflects on the fact that Republicans just don't feel that enthused about their candidates, and that Democrats, as these economic indicators have turned around, do feel like Obama's being vindicated from exactly those criticisms you mentioned, where, the Dow's not going right, unemployment's not going right, this president has failed, and now it looks like, maybe he's succeeding.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it's just, are we just reading the moods here of both parties, or?
Well, I do think it's interesting. Romney, I think it's interesting that Romney seems to have so much trouble talking about the fact that he's wealthy. He's got, the previous candidates have sort of run into this problem, right? I mean, I think the prototypical example is John Edwards and the whole haircut thing and living in a big mansion, but yet he's talking about the poor. And I thought that whole thing was kind of silly. Obviously, there were other problems with John Edwards that people weren't aware of at the time. But, but for a Democrat, it's all rich Democrats always seem to run into this. But you're rich, so why do you want to tax the rich type thing? But,
right.
But Romney is, he's a successful businessman. Theoretically, this should be something that is like a really great selling point for him. And he keeps being incredibly awkward about it. The best thing, of course, is, or my two favorite recent Romney awkward, wealthy Romneyisms are when he mentioned that his wife drove a couple of Cadillacs, as opposed to just, one. And when he mentioned that he didn't watch NASCAR, but a couple of his friends were NASCAR team owners. Right, it's strange to me that a Republican who is wealthy and is wealthy because they're a successful businessman should have so much trouble talking about it in a way that isn't embarrassing.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because there are some conservative outlets, like National Review, that were egging Romney on to try to defend his wealth when Newt Gingrich was attacking it in these kind of populist-sounding ads about, like, when Romney comes to town, and suddenly the consultant comes and cuts your jobs to make himself and his corporate buddies rich. And he did that a little bit in South Carolina, but then it's disappeared. And I think it's really the Republican Party, includes cheerleaders from the Wall Street Journal editorial board, but it also includes this huge white middle class and sometimes white working class populist constituency that does think that it's not just big government elites that are against them, but that somehow, any great fortune was the result of perhaps some great crime or great collusion or great privilege that
someone's rigging the game.
Yeah, that someone's reading me, that America is no longer fair or what it used to be. And I think it's a theme that came up in the Buchanan campaigns in the 90s a little bit. I mean, there was a famous, I think, Village Voice reporter who was tagging along the Buchanan campaign and told Buchanan, I've been waiting all my life for someone to say that Goldman Sachs was the enemy, and now it's you. And
awkward.
Yeah, exactly. And but obviously the coalition itself can't please everyone or you can't reflect back to everyone in the coalition exactly their attitude about wealth. But it has been really awkward for Romney in a way that I think, when we look at rich Democrats, even John Kerry, or going back to FDR, they are. I don't know if they had that same problem. I mean, John Kerry a little bit with the windsurfing, and people use that against him.
Oh, they totally used it. They said, "Oh, he's just wealthy because he married, because of his wife. He married into his wealth." There was a whole lot of contempt for that, for Kerry's sort of, like the way Bush got around his wealth was by being Mr. Clear and Brush, and by leaving consonants off the ends of his words. He had like a folksiness he could draw on, whereas Romney, anytime Romney tries to do anything like that, it's just super awkward.
Yeah, I mean, it is. I remember I was.
Anytime he does it, he just comes off like he's in the Roman Senate in a toga. Like, he's just completely patrician.
No, I mean, I was in. I remember 4 years ago, I was in New Hampshire, and he was in Nashua doing a walk through the town. And a guy, he's walking through and he's shaking everyone's hands, and a guy approaches him, and this gentleman was kind of rail thin, kind of had like a Marlboro hat on, jean jacket, kind of torn up jeans, and he went up to Romney, put his hand in Romney's hand, and said in this really plaintive voice, it sounds like I'm making it up, but he said, so we just got to take this country back. And Romney just puts this big fat grip with this plastic smile and says, "That's what we're going to do," in like a tone that was so many more times upbeat than the tone that was given to him. There's literally almost no human sympathy or connection at all.
Yeah.
It was literally like a guy just saying, "Hey, my kids are hungry," and and Romney walks up to him and is like, "We're going to win the Super Bowl."
Yeah.
And it was just so...
I just think it's funny because for once, at least in my lifetime, that's not entirely... Well, I wasn't politically aware when Bill Clinton was, running for office. But I think this is the first time in my, since, becoming cognizant of politics, where it's the Republicans who have the guy who, seems to have a hard time connecting with people. Whereas, there's this thing of Obama being cold, but if you look at the polls, people generally think Obama's a really friendly guy. Even people who don't like him and won't vote for him think he's a nice guy. And that he's likable. But it's sort of interesting because, for the past, 8 years before Obama was elected, you sort of Bush faced two guys who were sort of caricatured as as robots, the way the way people joke about Romney now.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's also maybe why 4 years ago Mike Huckabee was such kryptonite for Romney, because Huckabee was the most amazing retail politician I think I've seen besides Bill Clinton. Just one-on-one or lighting up a room, and it just doesn't exist anymore. Or at least that candidate doesn't exist on the Republican side, where you have Rick Santorum and Newt Gingrich and Ron Paul, who all can be off-putting in their own way, even when you agree with them. I don't know. So I wanted to talk about, we'll just move on to this other issue. We talked about how culture war issues are kind of dominating things, and we had this week where the issue of the HHS mandate on providing healthcare coverage inclusive of contraception, sterilization, morning after pills, and other things that are grouped under preventative care for women. The debate still goes on because this mandate doesn't go into effect for about a year. The Catholic Church has opposed it. We've had hearings. Then we've had lots of political theater about the hearings, including Rush Limbaugh this week calling a Georgetown law student a slut, and then doubling down on that 2 days in a row before finally sort of apologizing.
Well, so I think he might have been able to get away with the slut thing, as terrible as that is. Limbaugh's mistake, I think the point at which he really, really crossed a line to which he in hindsight, he's sort of given a semi-apology. In hindsight, I think the point at which he really sort of crossed the line, or at least crossed a line for people who, buy advertising on his show, was when he suggested that the women, because men were subsidizing her birth control, that she should videotape when she has sex and put it up on the internet for them to watch. I think that was really violated the sensibilities of 98% of people in the country.
Yeah, this is one of the grossest things I can imagine actually someone saying, and it's a telltale sign though that. In a sense, there's a huge number of people in the conservative coalition who don't understand what the religious objection to here is. And so they're kind of trying to make an argument based on either just tarring the other side, or an argument just purely about money.
Right, and that argument doesn't work because part of the way we have, there's actually an equal employment opportunity commission ruling from 2000 that says that that sort of wasn't entirely enforced. That sort of says if you provide prescription drug coverage, you can't exempt birth control, and that's in part, that decision was reached in part because we pay for Viagra or insurance companies pay for Viagra, and the Catholic Church has no objection to Viagra because it's not. It's I mean, reproduction is sort of something that it's something that you're expected to do. It's not that they're against sex.
Yeah,
sex
Viagra helps.
Right.
Yeah, Viagra helps reproduction.
But the money argument totally collapses under that, since if paying for birth control, quote unquote, is tantamount to subsidizing someone's sexual activity, well, we already do that in the form of Viagra. So it's just not a good argument. Also, Limbaugh seems to have been under the impression that birth control works like Viagra. I mean, he kept sort of repeating that. She's having so much sex she can't afford the pills, and it's like, well, no, that's not. That's not how the pill works.
No.
But I think so Obama sort of came up with this. Obama's sort of compromise or attempted a modification of the church's objections on this issue was that the insurance companies would have to provide the birth control. And that's not acceptable for a non-trivial number of the sort of
the opponents of this
of the people who are opposed to this. I will say that, like, philosophically, I take the view that paying, like, because insurance is part of compensation. It's saying objecting to someone getting birth control under their insurance is sort of like objecting to me buying an Xbox with my paycheck money.
Wages. Yeah.
Because it's my money, and I'm like that you're paying me to do this work, and this is what I'm using it for. And so it's not exactly like the money like the insurance company is paid and then it pays for birth control. It's more like it's more like paying taxes to subsidize things you might not believe in as a religious person, like military spending, or like God knows, any number of other things, including we because of Title IX, we do pay taxes to subsidize contraception, just in general. So philosophically, I see it a lot more like that than like as you put it, monks paying for birth control or sterilization.
Yeah, and I still hold to my philosophical view and the church's view that this amounts to a kind of formal cooperation in the way that tax revenues don't, because your agency is involved in this for two reasons. One, you sign a contract with the insurance company, and the insurance company will be providing this thing that you view as objectively sinful. And what hasn't been talked about is that the church views this as actually actively harmful to women and harmful to society. And then two, the other part that involves your agency is that, in a sense, you can't avoid paying taxes in this way, but you could, if you're a Catholic, just say, well, if you're going to force us to do this, we can sell our hospitals, dismantle our charities, and retreat from doing anything in the public.
Do you think that's going to happen?
I don't think it's going to happen. Well, let me put it this way. The church, when the church typically gets into a fight with the state, if the state applies enough pressure, usually most of the church just gives up and compromises. There'll be a few people that would be willing to go to jail. Going to jail for principle is kind of like an extraordinary, not normal thing for most people. So maybe the church will compromise. I mean, some of the bishops have taken an extraordinarily hard stand on this, and I think they're right to do so. And we've seen in Europe where the government becomes kind of either the sole payer for healthcare or just becomes deeply, deeply involved in healthcare, that there ends up being debates about, in England, whether Catholic people who want to become OBGYNs can exempt themselves from being trained to do abortion, or can a hospital exists that doesn't provide abortion or something else, or euthanasia or some other service. And you see sometimes that these Catholic hospitals, especially in Italy now, are being sold to the state eventually. And that's for both the reason that there's pressure not to offer health care in the way the church would define it, and then also probably just internal decay of the church too, where they don't have the resources to man these institutions.
Well, I don't think in the United States any doctor will ever be forced to provide a patient with an abortion. I think that crosses, I think that crosses a line that saying you have to, if you want to be a pharmacist, you have to fill birth control prescriptions. I think that crosses a line that does not. I'd be really surprised. I would be really surprised. The American political tradition is just so different from Europe's in this way that I just think that that's not going to happen.
My own view is that there is this long-term thing where the Catholic Church's enormous presence in the healthcare system in America is going to be this continuing source of tension and debate, where 1 in 8 hospital visits in this country is to a hospital affiliated with the Catholic Church, and there are other churches that have hospitals and Jewish congregations that run hospitals, and we're not just talking about hospitals too. We're also in the contraceptive mandate talking about schools, charities, and other non-parish related organizations, and even some dioceses are organized in such a way that they would fall under the mandate. But so you have this enormous part of the healthcare system, largest nonprofit sector of our healthcare economy, and if we ever moved to single payer healthcare and the government was directly paying,
you'd have an argument for saying hospitals have to do this.
And not only that, I mean, it would be like, why if the government is the sole provider or the sole payer, why is a substantial fraction of our healthcare related to this prince who lives in Rome? I can imagine that would be a source of ongoing tension. I mean, I don't suspect we'll get to single payer anytime soon.
No, I don't think we're getting a single payer. And more's the pity. But at least from my perspective,
it does raise questions, though. I think about. I think in a larger sense, this has raised questions, or should raise questions, for liberals about pluralism in America. Which is, can you allow groups that serve the public to kind of define their mission in ways that the government doesn't define that mission? So, the church is kind of making this radical critique of what the government says is normal health care or normal reproductive choice. And
so, I mean, I have pretty strong feelings about this, and part of this is just that I think, while I think regulating pregnancy is like a legitimate healthcare need, I also think that, women take birth control for reasons unrelated to sex, which is, regulating periods, making sure that they're not as painful. In the case of, this woman, Sandra Fluke, who Rush Limbaugh was insulting, she told that she actually didn't talk about her sex life at all, which is why it's sort of bizarre that everyone else is focused on it. But she mentioned a friend who was a lesbian, so she had no interest in taking birth control for the purpose of preventing pregnancy. But she was, she had polycystic ovarian syndrome, and they, and she was trying to, and birth control would have prevented her from losing an ovary. And the insurance company, and the way it worked at Georgetown was the insurance company evaluates whether or not you're trying to avoid getting pregnant, which I just think is a really sort of weird, this is Georgetown's way of trying to, ensure that only people with sort of quote unquote legitimate medical reasons have access to birth control. And of course, they were wrong. They denied her the pill and the birth control that she needed, and she lost an ovary. And I just for me, the easiest, simplest solution to that question is simply because there are so many varied medical reasons to take birth control other than preventing pregnancy, that even if you have an objection to preventing pregnancy, that the most humane way to deal with it from a philosophical perspective is simply to allow women to make the decision themselves.
Yeah, it's very difficult because the moral reasoning in Christianity just doesn't doesn't allow for that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's no, if you're knowingly signing off and paying for something, we recognize the principle in our justice system all the time, right? That you become an accessory to someone's crime if you knowingly provide them the means to commit it, mm-hmm. Or if you have good reason to suspect that they'll commit it, and then you provide those means for them to do it anyway. Mm-hmm. So if your friend talks to you about doing a robbery on a certain day, and then asks to borrow your car, and talks about going to Mexico with it, mm-hmm. if you loan him the car, you can be brought in as an accessory. Mm-hmm. And the church says, obviously, we're not talking about criminal statutes here, mm-hmm. but talking about criminal statutes before a much higher judge. Mm-hmm. The church would say, by knowingly doing this, we're committing a sin, mm-hmm. and the government has no legitimate just authority to demand this of us. Mm-hmm. And if they push it, Cardinal George says we'll lose all our institutions, mm-hmm. Or we'll face fines or imprisonment or something like that if we continue to resist. So I mean, I know that everyone wants the church to just shut the fuck up, mm-hmm. and pay, and get over it, but it's not that easy. So I don't know how this is going to be resolved in the long term. I think in the short term there might be, political considerations that come into effect of who gets elected in November, mm-hmm. and what Congress looks like that might adjust this mandate. But
well, so why? So here's my question though: why is paying an insurance company for an insurance plan that covers prescription drugs and that does not exempt birth control? Why is that different from the perspective of the church than Catholics, financing the American war machine through taxes?
Right.
From a philosophical perspective, why is that not also being an accessory, so to speak?
Both are present problems, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're a Catholic and you believe that the American government is engaged in an unjust war, you really do have the duty as a citizen and as a Catholic to use your powers as a citizen to protest that. But the moral guilt for the unjust war wouldn't fall on the taxpayer himself. It would fall on the government agents that decided to embark on this war, on the soldiers who knowingly did evil acts on its behalf, and it would indirectly kind of condemn all of the society that tolerated a government that did this. So, and I think we recognize that in our, in trials for human rights violations. Like we didn't punish German taxpayers for the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. But in this case, you are directly signing a contract with an insurance company to provide certain things. Mm-hmm. And from the Catholic perspective, you are literally inviting someone to do what you believe is grave moral, spiritual, and physical harm to themselves. Mm-hmm. And like I said, it does launch from this radical critique of, modern family planning, which which, the church says that this system where we treat pregnancy like, we talk about it almost as if it's a disease. So we need preventative care, or sometimes even the church criticizes it as a kind of excess of capitalism itself, as kind of like consumer choice to have a child rather than accepting it. And sometimes even the church is kind of, and this is interesting, bit of dialogue, is that Catholics that practice natural family planning, non-artificial birth control, they're often turning to resources provided by kind of crunchy liberals who kind of want a more natural lifestyle, and don't like the idea of ingesting chemicals.
A crunchy liberal conservative Catholic accent.
Yeah, no, it happens though. I mean, a lot of Catholics read this book, Taking Charge of Your Fertility, which is clearly like not written for a religious audience, but is sort of very critical of, the modern, idea that somehow women are liberated through the pharmaceutical suppression of their natural fertility.
Well, so so I just want to push back on this a little bit.
Sure.
It's interesting that Fluke has become sort of central symbol of this argument, because so much of what we're really talking about here is like married women who already have kids, who don't want more kids, or who don't want more kids yet, or who don't want more kids now, and not sort of, there's, Limbaugh, you sort of understand why Limbaugh thought he could win this one, right? So if you make this not about, if the symbol of the healthcare mandate is a bunch of libertine college students who just want to be able to, who just want to be able to have sex all the time, then you sort of, from a cultural perspective, he thought that sort of disgust would sort of carry him through.
They're not that sympathetic.
Right. But except, he overplayed his hand. But in general, we are talking about, women who are married who obviously love their children, who are not thinking of, who I don't think of pregnancy as a disease, but do think of it as something that they should be able to, that should only happen when they want it to happen, and not because Martin Luther King Jr. of course was a big supporter of birth control. He wasn't he didn't survive for the big abortion debates. He was killed before those happened. But he was, he was a big supporter of family planning because he felt that an inability to figure out when you had children was like a huge contributor, or to decide when you have children was a huge contributor to black poverty. And I just think, for a lot of liberals, I think this is why it's so important to ensure that, as long as we're on an employer-based healthcare system, which, truth be told, a lot of liberals and a lot of conservatives would want to get rid of, though they wouldn't replace it. Right. They wouldn't replace it with the same thing, but they want to get rid of that. It's really important, to provide people with the ability to make this decision. But I don't think, when we're talking, a lot of the women who use this, these married women who want to, who have kids, who don't want to have more kids, not that you only need to be married to be justified in spacing out your pregnancies, but, these are, I don't think philosophically they're looking at it the way that, that radical critique you're describing looks at it. Or,
certainly Rush Limbaugh isn't looking at it from the critique I would have of it, right? And that's right. I mean, I agree with the church's position on birth control. A lot of Catholic commentators, even conservative ones, don't agree with it, or they kind of agree with it, but maybe they don't live up to it, and so they don't want to talk about it that much.
Yeah.
One thing people pointed out is that people do actually confess using this stuff as a sin in confession, which means they might be counted in a gigantic number of Catholics who have used it, but it doesn't mean they morally approve of themselves for doing so. And I would say that, we do condemn the we do condemn the totally respectable married couple who is perfectly planning everything in their lives and trying with all their heart to ensure that each child gets the maximal amount of perfect attention. Yeah, we do condemn this kind of just as much as we condemn some, college student who just wants to have a few fun years or something like that. Yeah, and I'm not afraid to say that, and I would even satirize this kind of fetishization of planning among upwardly mobile suburban people or whatever, as potentially like gravely morally and spiritually harmful to them. And I'm not saying I want the Catholic Church's idea of planning is sort of like, it is a minority view.
But if planning is spiritually harmful, if there's something spiritually harmful about the idea of planning, not just the taking of this chemical that prevents you from prevents an egg from attaching to your uterine wall, but this idea of planning, then why isn't natural family planning also like just as spiritually harmful?
Well, this is a very good question, right? So the sin, and this is good to get into this, the sin is in deliberately making a sexual act unfruitful, by deliberately doing something to make it unfruitful. So it's not a sin to have sex when you are infertile or after menopause or if a man is impotent, right? So that's why, a lot of times people shoot back, well, what about, why do you allow people that have gone through menopause to get married if they can't have children, and that's the purpose? And it's because that's the narrow sin. But there's an attitude that goes around this sin, I think. And there are traditional Catholics that I know that are very critical of natural family planning as kind of like kosher contraception, and these teachings are supposed to encourage you to be open to the possibility of new life in your family. So I agree that actually that can be taken too far itself too, because this planning fetish can go beyond responsibility and into a kind of selfishness, we would say.
I think it's a justified selfishness. You know what I mean? I think people should be, it's a selfishness that serves both the interests of the individual who has a right to pursue their own interests and the interests of, the potential child, so that when they're born at a time when the parents have the resources and wherewithal to ensure that, the child is as well taken care of as possible.
Right. And I mean, our critique is that, in a sense, there's a way to control when you have children, which is that sex still is, in the vast majority of cases, like a voluntary activity. And that, that's of course like the one way to prevent children from being born is to not do that. And then secondly, there are major life-changing events. Like a lot of times liberals say, the birth of a child can produce financial, emotional, health stresses, etc. There are lots of things in life that we can't plan for that do that. The death of a parent, the death of a child, the death of a family member, job loss, and this is what Joel Klein was saying he was touched about with Santorum, which is that, or Joel Klein said he was haunted by the way Santorum talks about his daughter Bella, because yes, it does seem that sometimes when, we look at the life of a disabled person and say, and almost treat it as an inconvenience. I mean, and I think that, I don't know, I think that's right. I think, I feel justified in making that critique. I mean, I understand why people reject it. It is radical.
Right, but I mean, I think there's sort of a difference, right? I mean, like if you're taking birth control, that pregnancy never happens, as opposed to like, having an abortion because your child is going to have a developmental problem. Like these are I think two different.
No, they are two
different arguments. And what we actually published an article on Santorum pointing out that the affordable health care, he spent, if you look at his tax returns, he spent an enormous amount of money on home care. And we sort of wrote a piece being like, this shows like Santorum would have a family like Santorum's with these like incredible needs would benefit greatly under, the new healthcare system. And it takes this substantial amount of government support, particularly for, Santorum is among the least well. I mean, I think in Congress he might have been the poorest senator when he was there. I mean, he's not like, compared to like regular politicians, he's not of means. So like this it really is sort of a significant financial burden in a way that it probably wouldn't be for a much wealthier politician. So it's like really, it's really, disconcerting to think about the kind of burden that would place on someone who is, smack in the median in terms of household income.
But you can see also where he would come from on the other side, which is that, okay, if we're going to have government, what we're all afraid of, right, is that an accountant at an insurance company or government is going to come to Rick Santorum's wife and Rick Santorum when they're pregnant with Bella. And doctors did kind of gently try to pressure them, it seems, to do the right thing, which is don't let this child live and suffer. We
should be clear that this child, like, the prognosis is not good that they're going to survive.
Yeah.
It's very sad. It's awful.
Oh, no, it is. It is, but, that's really where we're getting to the heart of the matter, is that was this child's life worth living, and the kind of, maybe this is too idealistic to say is that, the burdens that this has imposed on Santorums have also, made them, shown that they have an ability to heroically sacrifice their time and effort, their ambitions for a child who is very unlikely to live to be 10 or 15 years old and will never have a job or, a prom date. But, my position is that life is more than about those measurable successes, even when it's, can seem very tragic. And he continually testifies about how much joy this has brought in their lives. So, I think the fear is that, if this always comes down to cutting costs, whether the government is running it or whether an insurance company is behind it, then someone's going to be in the position of pressuring parents like the Santorums to do the right thing, which is abortion or euthanasia or.
But of course, just again, we're talking. We're not talking about sort of selecting abortion because you find out your kid is going to have a serious developmental problem. Although people do have abortions for that reason, and I certainly don't judge them for it at all. But I think but birth control, of course, is different. I think there is an episode of The Simpsons about birth control, and I believe one of the sort of I can't remember the character's name, but it's one of the sort of bad kids who hangs out with Nelson Muntz. And when he's explaining to Bart what birth control is, he says, "Those are the pills that mommy takes to keep the babies up in heaven," which I thought was a sort of funny, but also very. It's like a very sweet thing to say to a kid to like explain what birth control is.
No, that is.
But
funny.
Of course, like he's like 16 or something, so it's like even funnier.
Yeah, no, it is funny. I mean, it's funny too. I didn't mention one other. I might as well get it all out, and then we'll move on. One of the other radical critiques of birth control is that most people in society think this represents an unbelievable liberation for women in their careers, and then Christians, particularly Catholics, come in and say, well, no, this is actually bad for women because it allows men and women to use each other as objects of pleasure apart from the kind of gigantic obligations and duties that conjugal love would normally imply or impose on people. And that this ends up being destructive to human relations. And, Pope Paul VI, who reiterated this teaching in the 60s against massive dissent within the church on it, and from his own theologians, predicted that there would be more pornography, more divorce, more illegitimacy, etc., at a time when most people are arguing that this is just a tool that responsible married people will use, and it won't change things very much. And it turns out that the sexual revolution has changed things very much. And a lot of the things that in 68 you would say, oh, that's just some slippery slope argument, are now considered the new normal and even positive goods in themselves. Do
you think birth control did that, though? I mean, I'm reminded of, there was maybe, in past times, I mean, it's not like people didn't have sex for recreational reasons. In fact, the way to avoid having another kid might have been to go to a whorehouse and hire a prostitute, whom then she would have to worry herself about what to do if she got pregnant. I mean, that's what it used to be. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, and I'm not arguing for that. It's
but I'm just saying, like the world, the sort of world of like this materialist world where sex is commodified, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I'm not sure that we were ever not in that world.
I think you're right. There's always been a desire for like mercenary, hot, sexy sex. Like there's always.
Well, I mean, there's a reason they call it the world's oldest profession, right?
Right. No. There's no doubt about that at all. But it certainly is the case. I think that birth control has the expectation of control through birth control, abortion, etc. has changed expectations too. So. Yes, sometimes someone would go to a whorehouse and it was up to the prostitute to take care of it, either to make herself infertile somehow or procure an abortion. But on the other side, there was an ability if, some cad seduced a woman, slept with her, she became pregnant, it could society still had the ability to pressure him to kind of do the right thing, which was more than just, court-ordered child support.
Well, under certain circumstances. I mean,
Yeah. No, I'm not saying there is no Eden that I can return us to, or that the church can return us to. So I'm not saying that, just preaching a different set of values would result in something awesome. No, that's just not the case. But I don't think we're living in an Edenic paradise now as far as relations between the sexes, family life, children and child caring, either. Anyway, this has actually gone in a kind of amazing direction. Yeah. Maybe we should.
Well, we're going to get. There's going to be, there's going to be the very justified cracks about two dudes talking about birth control for.
Yeah, totally, totally. It's funny too because the dudes, it's funny. The all male panel.
We just had an all male panel on birth control.
We just had an all male panel on birth control. The all male panel that is convened was supposed to be on religious liberty, but of course it was precipitated by this birth control mandate. But we just had the true all-male birth control.
Yeah, we certainly did.
But let's totally shift gears. This morning, APEC is having a meeting here, and there's just been a lot of talk about what is the room for liberal Zionism. And, you've been following a little bit of the Emergency Committee for Israel, and why don't you explain that just a little bit?
Well, so a few months ago, there was an article about the Center for American Progress sort of challenging the pro-Israel consensus in the way it was writing about Israel-Palestine issues. And a couple of CAP staffers and someone at Media Matters, a writer at Media Matters, used the term Israel Firster. And this and the Emergency Committee for Israel has sort of wrung every drop of blood out of this stone for the past few months, and they just published a huge full-page ad in the New York Times this week, accusing basically CAP and Media Matters of being anti-Semitic. And I just think, with the Emergency Committee for Israel, I mean, what they do is they sort of turn Israel into a partisan issue in the sense that their entire reason for existence is to make Democrats look pro-terrorist for any deviation from what they consider to be pro-Israel. And the truth is that, liberal, the truth is that if the price of being considered a Zionist is to quietly acquiesce to what Jeffrey Goldberg has described as the total South Africanization of Israel, if that's the price of being a Zionist in America, you are going to find that fewer liberals are going to identify as Zionists. And it's hard to see how that is ultimately good for Israel. But I think the irony is that the Emergency Committee for Israel is not as concerned with that as it is with, using Israel as a cudgel with which to beat Democrats unconscious. But I do think it has this, inadvertent or perhaps deliberate. I mean, perhaps they only want the kind of Zionists who would support a total Israel, even if it became an undemocratic apartheid state. Like that, maybe they're shrinking the tent deliberately, but they are, I think, shrinking the tent. We don't ask for this kind of loyalty in any group. I mean, Republicans are not all expected to agree with everything Republicans think, but for some reason, the idea that any criticism of Israel is inherently anti-Semitic, particularly even when it comes from, when it comes from people who consider themselves Zionists, is just not something that. It's the kind of thing that is simply going to make fewer liberals identify as Zionists, period.
Yeah, it's sad. I mean, in one way, obviously it seems counterintuitive that the debate about Israel should be narrower in the United States than in Israel.
It's totally bizarre.
But I do think it makes sense that it is, in the sense that, there's a great essay George Orwell wrote about transferred nationalism and how it's very easy to be more nationalistic about a foreign state than your own because you're always acquainted with the flaws.
The nuances, yeah.
Yeah, and the nuances and the citizens who disagree with you than you are with another. I mean, like G.K. Chesterton of England used to be like this insane Francophile because he thought it represented this great Latinate chivalry, and it's just betrayed his total ignorance of what France was. And so that is sad, and it does cut against. I mean, I come at this as a kind of isolationist, and my feeling is I don't want the United States telling Israel or anyone exactly what their true interests are. And I think other states would be better off to conduct their affairs independently of considerations of what a bunch of people in Washington, D.C. think. But in this case, I really do think that Israel really would be better off if it was slightly disentangled from
the United States.
Right, because everything that happens in Afghanistan or Iraq is then also transferred into what's happening in the West Bank and Gaza, and vice versa. And I think that intensifies and regionalizes the conflict in ways that are dangerous for Israel and America.
Well, it's just there's any resistance to the kind of pressure on Israel that would be necessary for Israel to reach a sustainable arrangement of two states living side by side in peace. And that's, that's because we're already, so we're already entangled in this. Like, there's no, it's like the employer-based healthcare system. There's no way where like we have the policy we have, and we have to figure out a way to solve our problems with it. There's no way for us to disentangle ourselves, even if that were desirable. But there is, like, so we have to sort of figure out a way to, make it work. And things seem to be getting worse, and possibly even unsolvable from the perspective of unsolvable in the ways that we've sought to solve it for the past 10, 20 years. So it's just, I don't know. I mean, like, it's an incredibly depressing situation. And I just think, one of the things that I think is really disconcerting is I was looking at polls the other day, and the number of people who actually oppose a two-state solution in the United States has gone up. So you have something like 30% of Americans, which is up from like 19% in 2002, who now, think that Israel should just hold on to the West Bank and Gaza, which is just, lunacy.
Yeah, it's distressing to even hear that. I mean, do you think at all, is there any sign that there is on the American left real resistance to or, kind of extreme critiques of Zionism? Because, frankly, I don't see it. I mean, what I see is that groups like the Emergency Committee for Israel are making, mountains out of molehills here.
Well, there's a few. I mean, like, there was a one-state conference at Harvard recently, and it's like there are vocal American critics of Zionism on the left, but they're not. That's far from the mainstream in the United States, because I think largely because of 9/11. I mean, like, if you look at like the polling, Americans had much more balanced feelings towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict prior to 9/11, and post 9/11, Americans completely support Israel, in part because Benjamin Netanyahu has done an excellent job of sort of persuading Americans that they're sort of in the same fight. The people who attacked you are the people who attacked us. We've been fighting this war for years. We're with you now, and it's not, and that's, I think that's largely, I think that largely explains the sort of but I think that more than anything else explains the sort of bipartisan consensus on Israel is just post 9/11, the forces that Americans see what Israel is dealing with as the same thing, as the same people who are trying to harm the United States.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I find this I find it extremely distressing, even for personal reasons, in that as an American Catholic reactionary who hates war, mm-hmm. I want no reason to ever criticize Israel or Jews or anything like that because of the historic mm-hmm. associations between a lot of the things I believe mm-hmm. and anti-Semitism. Mm-hmm. But I really don't like the idea that I find it uncomfortable when Bibi Netanyahu comes and speaks to a full Congress and gets absolutely thunderous applause for lines that are clearly intended as criticisms of our president. I'm trying to think of a time when this happens. I mean, I know that Americans are always flattered when a foreign leader comes over, mm-hmm. and when Tony Blair came over to kind of reassure Congress that they did the right thing by attacking Iraq, he was well received too. But
yeah, I mean, I found it extremely weird. And I think it's just part of. I mean, I think it sort of reflects the view of the Emergency Committee for Israel, which is that they're seeking to turn Israel into a wedge issue, to where it is. to where it's literally anti-Zionist to criticize Israel, or to say Israel needs to dismantle the settlements, or to say that Israel needs to come to an agreement with the Palestinians where the Palestinians have sovereignty, in their own territory. I mean, like that to extend to, or not just anti-Zionist but anti-Semitic. I mean, that's not, it's not healthy for anyone, least of all Israel.
Right, exactly. I mean, and that's the point, is that I think you and I both agree that Israel would be much better off if it could extricate itself from this occupation, if the Palestinians could be engaged in politics in their own state rather than in pure resistance of what they view as a foreign occupation.
Well, and you see this reflected. I mean, Obama never mentioned the settlements in his speech to AIPAC this morning. He didn't say a word about it, and they, and from the, in a way to sort of like the sort of Israel's creeping illiberalism, which is like the inevitable result of occupying another people, 45 years of military occupation. That's an existential threat to Israel as well, certainly to its democratic character. But Obama didn't even mention it. He spent most of the speech discussing Iran and basically saying, Israel, we have your back. We're not going to let Iran get a nuclear weapon, which obviously is that's a priority for AIPAC. But it is Obama got smacked last time around for saying that for restating the consensus of decades that the two-state solution needed to be along the 1967 lines, more or less, with land swaps. He got hammered for that, and he in this speech just like, oh, we're going to get peace. I know you understand how important peace is. Now Iran.
Yeah, it's sad. I mean, I understand the frustration of those who look at settlements that were uprooted and removed, and that was 6-7 years ago, and then still there are rockets fired into Israel, etc. But there's conflict is a kind of environmental condition during an occupation, and there's no way to if you conceive of yourselves as like the Hatfields and McCoys, there's no way to actually untangle, and do perfect justice and perfect retribution for every event that happened. And I don't know.
Well, there's a terrible. I mean, like, you look at the settlements, like they're sort of. It's hard to think of a project that's like more actually antithetical to sort of conservative first principles. I mean, there's like a horrible joke to be made here, right? Which is like, how do you get a Republican to support government subsidized housing? And answer, you put it in the West Bank. Like, they're an incredible drain on the state, and they only exist because of the state, and they're just not. Philosophically, they're just like the definition of a terrible big government boondoggle. And so it's like, it's sort of astonishing how fond of them some Republicans seem to be.
No, it's it's terrible. I mean, I understand, dreams of I don't agree with, but I understand people have these dreams of greater Israel, but it's not Israel's duty to make those dreams come true, and it's not in their interest to do so. And it's hard that, I mean, something, we talked about off air, let's say, is that, this is kind of, it's very difficult for Americans to look at a conflict now and see just, as I talked about before, an environment conducive to conflict, whereas we just want to see good guys and bad guys.
Right, yeah.
And I am very sympathetic with the Jewish state, and I think it has all the reason in the world to exist. I have no problem with an ethno-nationalist state. I do have a problem with an apartheid state that becomes disfigured in the way it continually must do injustices to
survive.
Yeah, well, to even exist on a day-to-day level. I mean, certainly.
But I think that's the position of most liberal Zionists. Like, they recognize, the point of liberal Zionism is they recognize the idea that Israel exists as a cultural and physical safe haven for Jewry and for Jews. But, to sustain that through, South Africanization is not something that they support.
Right. And listen, Edmund Burke said that if you want to love your country, it should be lovable. Make it make it lovely. And it has been sad to see the fences and checkpoints go up, and to pretend that the kind of the daily harassment and impoverishment of Palestinians is just normal security. I don't know. It's only. I think it is really just 9/11. Like, it's largely possible because of a dehumanization of Muslims and Arabs that has, occurred as a result. I mean, like, this is, as a result of what happened on 9/11, and as a result of, years-long wars. I mean, it's sort of, you have to. The mind has to sustain certain things. You sort of have to convince yourself of reasons why this is okay. And that, that erodes the soul, so to speak. It's true, and it's something that we avoided with, say, the conflict about the IRA versus the British government, which is that Americans, there's a substantial number of Americans, Irish Americans, who are very sympathetic to the IRA's cause, but no one ever viewed that struggle as or hardly anyone outside of Peter King viewed that struggle as like one of just unrelenting good versus unrelenting evil. Right. And now Jerry Adams and Ian Paisley are sitting next to each other years later, chuckling with each other, in a government that works, and where, not only has the kind of guerrilla warfare ended, but most, not all, but most of the kind of unofficial gang violence and retribution that went along with it is also disappearing. And, I'm glad that none of the major players like the United States were ever taken in entirely by one side or the other. And I just wish we could have that same case now. Well, on that note, we should probably end. We're going over. Thank you so much for having me on your on your inaugural show. Thanks. No, it was a blast. Yeah. And we'll do it again soon. And have a good week. Absolutely. Take care. All right. Bye. Bye-bye.